Be yourself, positive. Just another mindset.
Hello, friends, and welcome to a new episode of the Just Another Mindset podcast. We need a paradigm shift if it comes to our economic and social systems. Let us drive this change together. The Just Another Mindset podcast shares inspiration and tangible techniques on how to create seismic shifts in an outdated system, collectively and for individuals alike. My name is Ismael, and each week I bring to you a relevant conversation, message, or theme that will not only entertain you, but help you to change towards a more meaningful and satisfying life. Get encouraged by listening to successful thought leaders, inspiring individuals, and impressive changemakers. Change from within will last and create positive results for all of us. Let us get inspired and embrace collective changes for the better. In today's episode, I'm super excited to share with you the conversation that I had with Tim Jackson. Tim has been at the forefront of international debates on sustainability for 3 decades and has worked closely with the UK government, the United Nations, the European Commission, numerous NGOs, private companies and foundations to bring economic and social science research into sustainability. Tim is an ecological economist and writer. Since 2016, he has been director of the Center for the Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity, CUSP. CUSP is a multidisciplinary research center which aims to understand the economic, social, and political dimensions of sustainable prosperity. Its guiding vision for prosperity is one in which people everywhere have the capability to flourish as human beings, within the ecological and resource constraints of a finite planet. In this episode, we talk about degrowth and a just society. Tim has talked about prosperity without growth for decades, and we elaborate on how this discussion has changed. You will learn about what a life worth living can look like, and we take a look at examples from different cultures and countries. We talk about diversity, well-being, and a life after capitalism. We discuss reductionism, work, labor, and you will learn about planned obsolescence. You will hear about how a transition towards a more fair and just society can look like and what first steps towards it can be. We finish today on a discussion on hope, action, and human potential. And with that, Tim, a warm welcome to the Just Another Mindset podcast. And my first question for you today is, how do you feel and what is on your mind?
Well, I've just come from a day. My day job, if you like, is director of CUSP, the Center for the Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity, and I just come from a day, a little bit less than a day of heavy meetings. So I'm kind of rushing from one thing to the other. That's on my mind. The future of this kind of work is on my mind. The challenge of this kind of work is on my mind, and I think it's one of those areas of work where it's tremendously exciting because it's talking about change and talking about prospects for the future. But that in itself can also be challenging when it lies outside the mainstream a little bit. Your support structures are not quite coming from the establishment. There are battles that you have to fight. It's a day job which is as much built of frustrations as successes, and in which your motivation to keep going relies very much on a sense of the possibilities of change, let's say, and that's I mean, it's interesting because there's not many day jobs that ask you to continually generate that, and it's something that requires energy, it's something that requires time, it's something that requires nourishment, it's something that requires refreshment. And so a day like today, when I've been moving between meetings about the future funding of CUSP, and supervising some of my researchers in CUSP and talking about the organization of event that we're holding next week in CUSP. These, there's a kind of sense that you need resources, you need nourishment, you need time. And that time has to be, in some sense, time for nourishing yourself as well as nourishing other people around you. So that's my day up until this point, a feeling of a mixture of, possibility and challenge.
And it also needs a whole lot of dedication and motivation, as you stated. So thank you very much, especially in that regard, for making time for our conversation today. And you've already mentioned a couple of talking points where I'm sure we're going to go. To give a little bit of context, Tim, is in 2009, you wrote the book Prosperity Without Growth. And in a TED Talk of yours from 2010, you asked the audience to take a reality check. With the regard to, we're going to talk about economic systems, growth, degrowth, capitalism, and well-being today. And I would be interested, how has the conversation around growth changed over the past, let's say, 15 years?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's changed quite a lot. I mean, I think, that book started its life as a report to the UK government. And it was a report from an advisory body which the UK government itself set up, the Sustainable Development Commission. And so in some sense, I think I approached that very naively as, if I produce the evidence for you and tell you which policies you might be interested in, then you, dear government, might be interested in putting those policies in place and exploring this difficult question. And yes, I know it's difficult, but, we could, with some collective effort, make some progress on it, because there is evidence that you can bring to bear, there is policy that you can think about. And if I make that argument, as thoroughly as I can and put all those arguments down in the report, and then the report, which officially was a report to the Prime Minister in the UK, that's a really good starting point for making something happen. And I mean, I said it was naive. It was naive. If I had expected that, and I'm not sure looking back whether I really expected that or I expected it to create waves. But interestingly, the thing that happened when that report met the government, so to speak, when it landed on the Prime Minister's desk, was first a sense of outrage that an advisory body had dared to question growth, and then a deafening silence. There was nothing. There was no feedback from the government to the commission. There was no audience for that report within any government departments, at least for a while. And there was the press that we had lined up to talk about it, as you do for a major release of a report from a government commission. Nothing was published. So it was really very, very strange. It was like, put all this work in, write this report, make the arguments, think you're going to have some impact because it's a report to the UK government. Nothing happens. And then, that was really an indication of where that was, that debate at that time, that it was almost like a taboo. You weren't allowed to talk about those things. Certainly as a government commission, it was a really dangerous thing to do. And then, the interesting thing was that within a few days, actually, because this was just at the beginning of when the internet was a good place to load your reports as a government commission, and people could then get access to them freely. Within days, it was downloaded in its kind of tens of thousands and then hundreds of thousands. So the report, had a life that was never the one that I anticipated for it. And I wouldn't say that it started a debate. What it did was it fed into a debate that had been really very much under the radar. People who some of them had experience from the 1970s. We had all these octogenarian physicists who'd worked on the limits to growth back in the 1970s. And then I would turn up and talk about it, and there would be these young kids who were studying economics, but they got nothing about the limits to growth in their economics theory or in their courses or in their classes, and they were desperate to hear about it. And so it's sort of, that groundswell that came after the publication of the report, I think, was a beginning of one of those waves of critique of the limits to growth and the growth itself. And that has, over the intervening, whatever it is, almost 15 years, 14 years, that has ebbed and flowed, it's waxed and waned, it's increased at some points, at other points it's decreased. But in general, I think it is now that debate is a debate whose time has come, that there are people who are interested in it, there are people who want to talk about it. Even conventional economists are prepared to think about growth in a different way, partly because economic growth as economics sees it has gone away a little bit. You know, the trend rate of economic growth in countries, in advanced economies in particular, has been declining and declining and declining. And we actually have to think about what it means to do without growth in a way that in 2009, when that report was published, we didn't really believe that we had to think about growth as, you know, something in the past. We thought this is a temporary hiccup. This was the financial crisis, but don't worry, we'll bounce back from that. Everything will be okay. Nowadays, I think, you know, there is some recognition that isn't going to be the case. It's not going to be easy to just get back growth as economists and politicians would like it. And that's one of the things that's happened. And then another, of course, is that a whole generation of young activists has come out and explicitly said the economic system that has been driven by growth is destroying our planet. And that movement, particularly in 2019 and since 2019, has been another of those places where, you know, there's been a sort of an additional stimulus to questioning the idea of the fairy tales, as Greta Thunberg calls it, the fairy tales of eternal economic growth. And that young generation has a voice that's much, much louder than the voice of a commissioner on a government commission in the UK in 2009, and actually is, you know, beginning to make waves, make that debate about economic growth much more a thing of today, and a real deep questioning of the way that we organize society.
So what I hear is that it became from a fairly niche topic, which was still fairly sought after, into something that is actually very well and widely accepted into a much bigger movement. And
the debate is accepted. I think the debate is accepted. I mean, I wouldn't say that the critique of growth is accepted, at least. I mean, it is in certain places, more in academia, perhaps more amongst the younger generation, but still in an older generation and within government, within establishment, there's still a lot of skepticism, let's say, about the arguments.
And before we're going to talk about GDP and GDP growth in more depth, I would just like to give simple definitions. And GDP, the gross domestic product, is the total monetary or market value of all the finished goods and services produced within a country's borders in a specific time period. And I heard you saying in a different interview from 2021 that the concept of GDP, in essence, is a good one. And I would be interested, maybe we can tell the audience, why is the concept of GDP, in essence, a good one?
Yeah, I mean, I would preface that by saying that it's only a good one if it's used in the right way. And the way in which it's a good one is that it's a useful measure through which you can understand the structure of your economy. You can understand what's produced, you can understand what's sold, what the economic value of those sales are. You can understand what we spend our money on and differentiate between what households spend and what governments spend. You can understand how much labor, how much time you need for people working to produce those goods. You can understand what the productivity of your economy is. There's lots of things that you can understand about the nature and structure of your economy through the GDP. Where it goes wrong, it seems to me, is when you take that measure of the GDP as some kind of proxy for all of the social and policy goals that you want in society. We want people to be healthy, we want them to be well, we want them to live in good houses, we want them to have fantastic communications potential, we want them to be more and more aspirational, we want them to live the best life that they can, and the GDP is the way to do that. And that's a mistake. And actually, the mistake has been recognized for decades. In fact, Robert Kennedy famously, in a speech in 1968, pointed out all the reasons why the GDP is not a measure of well-being, and ended up, he concluded by saying, it measures everything, in short, except that which makes life worthwhile. It measures lots of important things in relation to the economy, and it measures virtually nothing that really matters to us as human beings. And that's, that's the good and the bad of the GDP.
And before we talk about in a little bit more depth what makes life worthwhile, you partially gave the answer already, but if I read out the definition of GDP growth, it is, in simple terms, economic growth refers to an increase in aggregate production in an economy, which is generally manifested in a rise in national income. So far, so good. Often, but not necessarily, aggregate gains in production correlate with increased average marginal productivity. That leads to an increase in incomes, inspiring consumers to open up their wallets and buy more, which means a higher material quality of life and standard of living. But as you just stated, this is not necessarily what makes life worthwhile.
Well, it's also a little bit worse than that, because it isn't always true that it leads to that higher material standard of living. And that's because the average growth in the economy is not distributed equally through the economy. And that means that, for some people, they're getting richer and richer. They're able to afford more and more fast cars and bigger houses. And it doesn't really increase the material standard of their life. It just increases their opulence, their affluence. And at the same time, because it's not equally distributed, there are poor people still living in shit homes without the ability to feed themselves properly or heat the home through the winter through a fuel crisis. And that's, that's a harsh reality that the GDP does not even remotely capture.
And I believe that the just given statement is even more relevant if we look back the last 10, 15, or also only 5 years, right? I think this discrepancy, this inequality within society is in fact growing. So average this or that, but the inequality within society and within economic buying power is in fact worsening. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
It is. You have to be a little bit careful with the statistics. The income inequality grew massively between the 1970s and the financial crisis. And after that, it's stabilized a little bit. Wealth inequality continued to grow and is increasing still. And so in broad terms, you're right, particularly in advanced economies, inequality is growing.
I have another question in regard to GDP, and this is from a report of yours. It's called Wellbeing Matters, Tackling Growth Dependency. It's a policy briefing for the APPG on limits to growth from 2020. And it reads, junk food, drugs, cigarettes, congested roads, traffic accidents, knife crime, alcoholism, gambling addiction, oil spills, carbon emissions. All of these things can contribute to a growing GDP. None of them can be said to be good for us in the long run. So how do we measure the things that are good for us, or how do we also define what the right things are?
Yeah, that was me kind of channeling Robert Kennedy in a way, that bit of writing in that briefing paper, and it's really interesting to go back to his original 1968 speech at the University of Kansas, where he talks about it, and and the fact that it's been known since that time that it's not just, our well-being is not just about material poverty. It's not just about income poverty. It's not just about the standard of living as defined by what's in our wage packet at the end of the week or the end of the month. When you come to trying to define, what it is that you should measure. I mean, there is one of the problems, of course, is that there are things which are almost immeasurable. What's the value of family security? What's the value of the love of our friends? What's the value of a beautiful day in a countryside that's unspoiled by pollution? And and in a way, what's gone wrong in our sense of the well-being economy is that we've put so much effort into things that we can measure, and then decided that those measurements constitute well-being, and it isn't the case. Well-being is much more nebulous in some ways, but that doesn't mean to say that there aren't things that you can measure in relation to it. So, for example, when you ask people about what their well-being consists in, one of the obvious answers that comes back almost first on the list, time and time again, is health. If you don't have your health, then it really doesn't matter how much money there is in the bank account. If you don't have your health, then you can be producing and consuming as much material stuff as you like, but your quality of life is very much diminished. And so there is a sense in which health is one of the principal things that we should be focusing on. And we should think of prosperity as health rather than prosperity as wealth. And that, just that mind shift in itself is very interesting, because if you think of prosperity as wealth, you basically think more and more is inevitably better, because the more wealth I have, the greater, the better off I am, the more I can invest in things, the more material security I can achieve. Wealth is about more and more. But health, when you get to think about it, is never about more and more. It's never about more and more food, for example, because there's a point at which, once you've satisfied your need for food, having more food actually makes you ill. And in fact, we live in a world in which there's a crisis of obesity, and more people are dying from overnutrition than from undernutrition. And that's a situation that is kind of difficult for a growth mindset to grapple with, because the growth mindset is more and more is better and better. In health, it's about balance. It's about a balance between having too little and too much. There's no doubt that if you are starving in sub-Saharan Africa and the harvest has failed again, you need more food. There's no doubt about that. That's the point where your health depends on having more. But actually, there's also a point at which that tips over, and when actually having more and more makes you unhealthy. Health is about a balance. It's not about more and more. It's not about less and less. It's about a balance that tells you that you have the right nutrition in the right quantity and the right quality to have a healthy, long life. And so what should our indicators be in relation to prosperity when we think of it about health? They should be, of course, how long people live, what the quality of their life is, what their access to healthcare is, whether they're getting the right nutrition, whether the food supply chains are allowing them to get the right nutrition, whether there is a fair distribution of that nutritional requirement across society. So all of those things you can measure. You can measure longevity, you can measure health, you can measure access to food, you can measure the distribution of the access to food. And this is not one single measure like the GDP that just goes getting bigger and bigger, but it is like a kind of dashboard of indicators that tell you how you should be moving society, how you should be understanding the state of health of society, how you should shift policy to protect people's health and their well-being. And it's actually not rocket science. It's still not rocket science. It's more complicated than simple GDP growth is better, but it is still stuff that you can go out and measure and understand and impact through policy.
Is this part of the challenge why it has not been put in place or put into practice for many years, even though we know it, that there are some universal needs as we just described, but they also differ from place to place. So in the UK, they might be slightly different than in the Netherlands, then they might be slightly different in Mexico or somewhere in Africa, somewhere in Asia. Is that just making it more complex part of the reason why we have not in fact agreed upon them on a global level yet?
Well, possibly, but then actually the assumption of your question and the premise of your question maybe we shouldn't be agreeing on them at a global level. Maybe it is down to each region to understand its needs and how to measure those needs. Maybe it is, one of the cultural differences that matters to hang on to a different concept of well-being in one place than another place. And I think that's quite an important point, really. I don't think the critique of growth, the critique of the dominant global myth of economic growth, I don't think the answer to that is to suggest that we have to find another global myth that we impose on everybody else in just the way that the UK did on its colonies back in the 16, 17, 1800s. That cannot be the answer. Nonetheless, you could say, so it's not about, imposing another global currency that has to be accepted by all these poor countries before we can allow them to develop. It's actually, more of a kind of responsibility in a way for the developed economies to say, yes, that these basic needs are being deprived for people in the poorest countries in the world, even as we in the developed countries are over-consuming. We're developing non-communicable diseases. Our obesity levels are going through the roof, and our health systems are crumbling under the impact of it. We, in this context, should actually have a responsibility to be measuring the right things, the things that are right for us, in a way that doesn't destroy the planet and doesn't destroy opportunities for other people. And it's not our job to go to, poorer countries, Latin America, Southeast Asia, and tell them what matters to them or what well-being is for them. That's actually their job. And of course, it's connected. Their well-being is connected to our well-being. Our well-being is connected to theirs, partly through the global impacts that we have from our economic system, such as climate change, but also partly through trade, partly through communication, partly through cultural change and immigration. So it's not a disconnected world, but neither is it a sort of a homogeneous world in which we impose one simple idea on everyone and argue that that's what everyone should be doing. So your question is very valid. Does that make it more difficult to make that transition or less difficult to make that transition? I think it makes it more difficult in a world in which global power operates in a way that tries to homogenize things. And that very definitely did happen after the Second World War, particularly in the economic system through the Bretton Woods Agreement. The world became a place which was essentially dominated by a Western view of what culture was, what economic success meant, and how you should measure that. And that's where the GDP came from, essentially. It came from that sort of homogenized view of a globalized world in which the view largely of the Western economies was the one that dictated the shape of our societies. And I think to some extent, of course, changing that is a challenge. But if you're thinking about it, as a challenge from the bottom up, maybe it's actually easier to meet that challenge if you accept that there are diverse views about what well-being means. There are diverse views about what it means to be healthy. There are diverse views about what it takes to be healthy. And that diversity can actually be a resource for different regions, different countries, different people to pursue well-being in their own way.
That's a very powerful statement. And I think you already mentioned this mind shift. And I suppose that we are just as society or the global north so used to this reductionism mindset, let's say, that we try to isolate one issue, one challenge, and then throw the best possible, the best measurable, or the most efficient solution on it. But accepting that there are, in fact, different solutions, ways forward for the same challenge, depending on where you are and when you solve it, and potentially even with how many people and where you solve it.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I talked about health, and health in some ways is the thing that you can universalize most easily or relatively easily. You can universalize the idea that someone has a long life, they don't suffer from lung disease, they don't get cancer, they get good access to primary health care, that their days are not beset with pain and anxiety. You can sort of argue that that's a kind of basic human quality, a basic human right that is universalizable to some extent. But that isn't the only thing that people talk about when they talk about what prosperity is or what well-being is. The things that they talk about are also about, the love of their friends, the security of their family, the strength of their and integrity of their environment, the towns in which they live, the community that they live in, and indeed beyond that, about having dignity, having a sense of meaning and purpose in life. And when you're talking about things like meaning and purpose in life, it's obvious. Different things will give different people a sense of meaning and purpose in life. You can argue that, for example, to be involved in meaningful work, to be able to participate in society, that's probably close to being something which is universal, because we are all social beings, and it matters to us to be thought well of by our friends and our colleagues and our acquaintances and our society as a whole. So there is a sense, there is something underneath it which is universal. But in every society, in every community, and for every individual, that sense of what it takes to live a life of meaning and purpose will be different. And that's where, in a sense, once you're not dealing with this single, simple, completely wrong number of the GDP as being your measure of progress, it gets messy. And in a sense, I think well-being economics is messy. It insists in a way that we resist the idea of a simple, single, clean, almost spreadsheet-ready way of telling us whether we are doing well or not. And it insists that we interrogate the depth of what it means to be human beings, what our aspirations are, what gives us meaning and purpose, how that's organized in society. And that will differ from place to place.
And even though if that would differ, I hear that this self-awareness can be quite a fundamental component of then figuring out what is actually giving us meaning, driving us to create purpose and so forth.
Yeah, I think it is essential. People often at this point talk about a psychologist called Abraham Maslow, and he presented something. Originally, he presented it as a kind of hierarchy of human needs. So you have the kind of material needs at the bottom, and then you have social needs for security a little bit higher than that, and then above that you have these kind of relational needs with each other, and above that again you have a kind of aspiration for self-actualization, a sort of self-awareness of your goals and your ambitions and your pursuits that will make you that will allow you to flourish as a human being. And it's a very interesting story around this. And most people when they use Maslow, they tend to forget it. But when he presented that originally, it did appear as a kind of a hierarchy, that until you've met your material needs, you can't afford the luxury of thinking about your social needs, your relational needs, your self-actualization needs. But later in his life, actually, Maslow said, in retrospect, looking at the evidence for it, I don't think it's quite like that. I think it's a kind of a duality, that you have these material needs that have to be satisfied, but actually we're not human beings if we only focus on satisfying our material needs. We have these non-material needs, these relational needs, these self-actualization, aspirational needs, and they are as important as each other when it comes to thinking about what our needs are and how we satisfy them, and what our well-being is and how we create that well-being. And I think that's a really important lesson. It tells us that there are different kinds of health, there are different kinds of well-being, there are different kinds of prosperity, and that we can't always simply prioritize one kind of prosperity over another. We have to have an eye at least to that duality, to that idea that we are not just material creatures. We are profoundly social creatures with aspirations and a sense of our own place in a finite material world.
Let's use this finite material world as a little of a segue. And in March 2021, you released the book Post-Growth, Life After Capitalism. And I also want to quote here, it reads, "Capitalism is broken. The relentless pursuit of more has delivered climate catastrophe, social inequality, and financial instability, and left us ill prepared for life in a global pandemic." So we talked about capitalism, we talked about GDP and the growth paradigm that we have experienced or still are experiencing. So Tim, what comes after capitalism? I know it's a very broad question, but what are the first things that come to mind, and then we can discuss from there?
Yeah, it's in a way that calling it Life After Capitalism, it was quite a provocative title, of course, and there's a chapter, the second chapter in the book is called "Who Killed Capitalism?" And at the time when I was writing it, there was a lot of critique of capitalism itself, and a lot of also a sense of reinventing capitalism so that it would be a good capitalism rather than a bad capitalism. And the most obvious answer to the question who killed capitalism is nobody. In spite of all that critique, capitalism is alive and well and is flourishing in all sorts of places, from London to Mumbai to Davos in Switzerland, where the good and the great meet every year to talk about increasing growth. And that's obviously true, that we are not yet living in a post-capitalist world, although we've seen some signs of it. You could argue, for example, that the pandemic itself, we saw interventions by governments which were outside the realm of what capitalism normally thinks governments should be doing in society. So, repurposing supply chains to meet our health needs. That was something that it was not about the market. It wasn't about exchange. It wasn't, or at least in principle, it wasn't about the accumulation of wealth. It was about the protection of health. And so that was there was a kind of post-capitalist moment, but of course it wasn't still after capitalism. It was still a sort of brief respite, if you like, from capitalism. So what am I doing by asking, what am I doing by using that subtitle, Life After Capitalism? I'm kind of, in a way, it's a way of asking people to sort of think outside of our own culture and our own history. It's a way of saying every system of social organization that we know of, from all the anthropological evidence, arises out of history, flourishes for a moment, and then it will change. And that will be true of capitalism. Capitalism is not here forever. Even if it's not dead yet, it's not going to be here forever. And so this is a moment in time at which to think about what it might look like afterwards. And so the book is really, it's almost a philosophical reflection on that, and it looks at capitalism's role in relation to work. It looks at capitalism's role in relation to investment. It looks at capitalism's role in relation to the markets. It looks at capitalism's role in relation to our hopes and our dreams and our aspirations. And it sort of says, are these values that capitalism brings, are they the right ones for our world at this point in time? Is it right, for example, to think that everybody is basically a selfish, acquisitive consumer of material goods? Is that actually a value that we want in our economic system and in our society at large as a whole? Or actually, is there some recognition that as human beings we are altruistic, we care about others, we are not just novelty-seeking hedonists, but we care about tradition and things being secure for our children so that they can grow up in a world which is safe? Are these values that matter to us? And if they are, then how does that fit with the capitalism that we've inherited? Does capitalism protect those values, or does it undermine them? And at the end of the day, the kind of the life after capitalism is a sort of, it's an appeal, it's a call to arms, it's a shared endeavor, it's an invitation to to everyone to engage in that conversation about the kind of society that we want, and whether, I mean, I suppose I, through the book, increasingly argue that it doesn't, but whether the capitalism that we have, whether the organizational system that we have is capable even of developing those, of protecting those values. And if it isn't, then what are the systems and how do we build the systems that will protect those values? But first of all, what are the values that we want to protect? And how do we ensure that they are protected? So the book is a kind of, as I say, a philosophical exploration, not about a world that already exists, or even necessarily immediate policy prescriptions in the way that I talked about in Prosperity Without Growth. Prosperity Without Growth was a report to the UK government. You had to have policy prescriptions. Post-growth is much more of a reflective piece, and it's asking us, inviting us to ask ourselves what matters and what the values are through which we could build a world after capitalism.
Yeah, I believe it's an invitation to participate and to co-create, and as you so nicely just summarized, ask the right questions, right? So just a few notes that I took, like the assumptions that we also have about the individual in a capitalistic society. I think more and more we are coming to a conclusion that those assumptions, or those values, as you just called them, are not the ones that are going to be the building blocks for something after capitalism. So understanding that capitalism is not necessarily there to stay for the next 200 years or 20 years or 50 years, whatever the end might be, and to co-create, and also to understand that we as people are the ones, in fact, who have the power to change something. So capitalism, the system, whatever you want to call it, is not something that's imposed on us and we cannot do anything about us. But in democratic societies, which we call ourselves citizens, we are in fact the ones, if we imagine and if we start thinking about alternatives, we are the ones who make change and who can create the new systems.
That's exactly right. We are the ones who make change, and we're also the ones who are immersed in the existing system. And so actually being able to free ourselves from our immersion in those existing systems is a part of our ability to envisage change. We want to, shake the shackles of capitalism that keep us tied into the structures of growth in order to be able to see what comes next. Let's just give you one little example. One of the things that I talk about in the book, which is around work. And the philosopher Hannah Arendt made a really interesting distinction between what she called labor and work. So labor is all of those tasks that are about, the maintenance of life, the care of each other, the provisioning of the everyday, the household of our economy, if you like. And I mean, what's interesting about labor, those tasks, there are two interesting things about it. One is that those were exactly the tasks that mattered most during the pandemic. The frontline workers, the people who were caring and helping and delivering food and that everyday labor of life, which sometimes can be absolutely exhausting, because quite a lot of it is manual work, or it's social work, which is very, very demanding. And those people essentially who were the front line during the pandemic, they most of what they were doing is what Hannah Arendt would call labor. And yet it's under capitalism, it's almost denigrated, it's degraded, it's seen as lower class work. Wages are poor, job security is non-existent, the conditions of work are really bad. And when you ask the question why, it's basically because those people are not seen as productive. They're not seen as producing material which can be sold for money to create value added in society. But nonetheless, they are absolutely essential to all of that. They're essential to the foundations of life, and yet capitalism undervalues them. And then what Hannah Arendt talked about in terms of work by distinction, she made this really interesting observation, which is that, when the hard labor of the day is done, if we have any time left, we look up from the exhaustion of looking after ourselves and looking after our kids and cooking our meals and building our houses. And what do we see? We see our own mortality. When we have time to reflect, we are a clever enough species to realize that one day we're going to die. And that terrifies us. And our response to that, according to Arendt, is to try to create something that outlasts us, to build a society, to create artifacts, to do works of art, but also to design things that go on for a long time, that last for a long time, that have a sense of immortality to counteract our own fear about our mortality. And this is what she characterizes as work. So labor is the grunt of everyday life. Work is this task of trying to create immortality out of nothing, knowing that we ourselves are mortal. So capitalism degrades labor. What does it do to work? Well, this is really interesting. I mean, the literature on economics from the 1960s onwards began to tell us that one of the things that capitalism does is to plan obsolescence, to make things so that they fail, to make them so that they break down. In other words, to make them as temporary and elusive as possible, so that we can then go and create wealth by building more and more of them. In other words, to undermine the immortality of the artifact, to undermine its durability. And so capitalism is basically destroying labor and destroying work, that endless task of confronting our own mortality. And it's doing it in favor of a kind of illusion that what matters is the accumulation of wealth. And, you know, in some sense, when you look at it like that, and Arendt was writing, you know, in the 1950s, 1960s, seeing these things and arguing these points about the division between labor and work and the way in which capitalism undermines both of them. And yet we've gone on for half a century or more, still embedded in a system. But now we can see it even more clearly. We can see actually that, you know, the durability of the artifacts in our everyday life is getting shorter and shorter, that we cannot expect anymore. Our technological devices, the machinery in our homes, the home appliances, our clothes, even everything has become a kind of throwaway in order to feed the kind of capitalist obsession with economic growth and to keep that growth going. But in the process of doing that, it's undermined our psychology. It's made us less secure. And it's also undermined the ability of our own ability to care for ourselves as human beings. So it's undermined both of those things that Arendt was talking about. And it has done it not by accident, not even by ill will, but through the design of capitalism itself. And so the task of unraveling that, you know, wow, you have to kind of step back and you have to see through the philosopher's eyes what it is that human beings are trying to do. Yes, provision for themselves, but yes, also accept and deal with our own mortality and figure out what our response to that is. And then you look at the social system and you say, does the social system deliver that security with which ordinary people can provision themselves, or does it punish those workers in that sector that are trying to create a decent life for people? Does it undermine the integrity of women's work, for example, who have traditionally and increasingly and still are doing most of that work in care and in household management? Does it support that? And of course, the answer is very, very obvious. It consistently undermines it. And does it undermine or does it support our sense of security in ourselves? Actually, you know, it not only doesn't support that sense of creating artifacts and durability that will outlast us, it systematically undermines it. And it undermines our own psychological security in the process, because creating anxious, insecure individuals is a good means to promoting the values and the virtues of consumerism and materialism. And that's, you know, that's a point where you kind of just have to step back and say, that's not in anything to do with well-being. Neither of those ways of undermining labor or work have anything to do with well-being. Capitalism is opposing, it's in opposition to a well-being society, and that's why we have to be rigorous, I think, in our interrogation of its values, and also, forthright in our setting out of values in opposition to it.
Tim, transforming capitalism into something, let's call it well-being economies, and to a new paradigm, what are things that come to mind? We talked in the very beginning about a time horizon of 14, 15 years, but we may choose a much shorter one here. What are changes that you envision, but also anticipate to come in the next 2 or 3 years that make you hopeful?
I think we are kind of, in some sense, reaching all sorts of crisis points, and picking up that theme of prosperity as health, and the economy itself, the role of the economy in the care of health. That crisis is very, very evident, because we're finding it difficult to difficult to support care systems, healthcare systems. We're finding it difficult to deliver primary health care. We're finding it difficult to deliver social care and to look after older people and our younger kids properly. And we can't figure out, one of the things that we haven't managed to do yet is to figure out how we can afford that, and that is a challenge which is kind of, in some ways, is getting worse and worse. And that might not sound like, I'm offering you signs of hope, but I'm offering a place where the debate is coming to a head, where the necessity to think differently about the economy is becoming more apparent. And that, I think, is that sense of hope lies in the realization that people have, that ordinary people have, that the system is not working in the way that it's supposed to work, and is not delivering healthcare, is not delivering security, is not looking after old people's needs, it's not looking after the ability of parents to protect their children's needs. It's capitalism focuses its attention on the working life and the productivity of the working life, and yet it neglects the quality of that life, and it neglects the human aspirations of people in society who are not paid within that structure. And what we're seeing at the moment is, not just the realization of that, but also the realization that there are things we could do about it. I think there are policies that could be enacted. So policies like, the basic income that would allow people to undertake some of these tasks and be supported for them. There's, ideas about the working week and reducing the working week. So instead of just being seen as productive citizens in that monetary paid sense, we can also be productive in the sense of creating home and creating relationship, and in fact enjoying the fruits of that production, and our aspirations for a better life. And then we see also, I think, a kind of in the well-being economy itself, we see a vision for what it might mean for, not just for individuals, but for countries as a whole, to organize around that goal of the well-being economy. And that wasn't there 14 years ago. That's a dialogue that's changing rapidly, and that will bring its own changes as we move forwards. It will become a place where we will begin, I think, to think seriously about that post-capitalist world, to think seriously about a post-growth world, and to begin to devise the kinds of economics, the kinds of policies, the kinds of institutions that will feed into a sense of human well-being, a sense of human flourishing in a very, very different way. I wouldn't say that's going to happen overnight. I think there is a demand for it, and there is a demand for it that is immediate, that really calls for immediate change, and that immediacy is difficult because the political establishment is still resistant to those changes. And yet it's something that ultimately, I think, to come back to the point that I raised earlier, that that economic growth isn't there in the way that it was before. The economic system isn't working in the way that it was supposed to work. The inequality is rising in a way that's dangerous and actually challenges social stability and the stability of our societies as a whole. That is a real indictment. That's a real indictment of the existing system, but it's also a huge incentive to change. We have to build that post-growth world, not just because it would be a nice, fluffy fairy tale to have, but because what we thought was going to be the fairy tale has now proven to be deceptively wrong and disastrous. And so, our task, our kind of sense of hope has to be aligned with a sense of agency and action. It has to be aligned with an urgency about the changes that we need to create that vision.
The sense of urgency, but also that something will happen and will change. So I actually hear quite a bit of hope there, which answers the first of my final three questions: what makes you hopeful? The second one, Tim, would be, who are mentors, or whom do you personally look up to?
All sorts of people, really. I mean, in one sense, post-growth, the book that we were talking about just now, was a sort of homage to the people that I have found inspirational, kind of lots of different people. So from, Bobby Kennedy to Herman Daly to Hannah Arendt to Emily Dickinson, who I come to in the final chapter, American poet, to Wangari Maathai, who founded the Greenbelt movement in Africa, and the stories of all these people as are not just they're stories of people who are not just intellectual heroes of mine, but also whose lives characterize change and characterize that challenge to the system. And there are people that in some ways touched my lives personally, or sometimes professionally, and who prepared the ground for the kind of work that I ended up doing. And I think, in a way, one of my ways of thinking about that is that we're all preparing the ground for the people who will come after us. And if we build at all, we only build on what has come before. And so paying homage to those people who've given their lives to those intellectual ideas, who've lived their lives in particular ways, who've given us an example of how it could be different. Thich Nhat Hanh is another of my characters, a Vietnamese Buddhist monk who dedicated his life to peace and the peace movement. And as I was writing post-growth, I just increasingly, as I began to write about these people, about their lives, I had this sense almost of us as part of a tide of history that's always moving forward, and in which our biggest resource is not just our hope for the future, but actually our honoring of the ideas that led us to where we are, the ideas of the past, the things that we can build from, the things that inspire us, the examples that people gave, the lives that they lead. And that I think is it's hugely important. It's something that's sometimes kind of forgotten. A younger generation always wants to differentiate itself from an older generation. It wants to be the one that's invented the new thing, and that's a very understandable motivation. But at the same time, it should be, and that power of change is really important, that sense of a younger generation sweeping things away and building something different. But it is a hope, at least of mine, that in the process of doing that, each generation honors the generations that came before and the ideas that came before, and because not just for the sake of those dead philosophers, but because actually this is a real resource for change, to recognize that ideas and visions and values are not something that arise out of nowhere. They belong to the past, the present, and the future. They are embedded in the ideas of the past, and even the most radical ideas that we can think of for our own future. You will find the roots of those in the thinking of people who have gone before, and I think it's really important to honor that.
No, absolutely. It's a very rich perspective. So thank you very much for sharing that, Tim. And that leads me to the last and final question for today's podcast episodes. And it's a rather hypothetical one, and I call it the 3 truths. So Tim, I would like you to imagine that you're traveling all by yourself in space, actually for quite some time. Could be a couple of months, could be a couple of years. And after all that solo travel, you encounter a human-like species, and they can only process 3 facts or 3 truths about humanity before they decide whether or not they want to get to know us. What is it that you tell them?
Well, let me first say that if I encounter those people after 2 years of being entirely on my own, I mean, it would be a little bit like when I met my research team again after the pandemic in person, because we'd only seen each other on Zoom for, 2.5 years or something. And there was really, and I think a lot of people experience this, but there's almost a kind of unbelievable sense of a warmth towards people, towards real people, seeing those people and working, and people that you've worked with, people that you knew before or developed a relationship with during the pandemic in a particular way. The physicality of human beings is really important. So and I think that anecdote in a way tells me at least 2 of the things that I would say about human beings. One is that they are physical creatures, that they are embedded in the materiality of the world. They are, in a sense, they're just a collection of bacteria who happen to have an organic form that's distinguishable from each other, and that physicality really, really matters. It matters in the way that they behave. It matters in what they need. It matters in the kind of interactions between them. And it matters in their survival, because if they reject that physicality, that materiality, they're essentially rejecting the means of their own survival. So that physicality really matters. And then the other lesson from that anecdote is the sociality of human beings. We are enormously social beings. And, that sense of relationship with each other is as important as the physicality. It's neglected in our social systems and in capitalism, exactly as I spoke about it. It's neglected as being, trivial in relation to material accumulation, and that's completely wrong. It's absolutely profound. I would have given up dinner for a week to have been able to see those researchers just for half an hour in the middle of the pandemic, when we were all locked down and all isolated. And after I'd been traveling for 2 years through space, I would definitely want company, that sense of wanting and desiring company with each other, that sociality, that's really important. And then I think, thirdly, I think you would probably have to say, I mean, this is a difficult one because I don't want to end on a kind of negative thing, but that humans have a enormous potential, and that potential can be either good or bad. And so, how you organize humans when you come across them, even the ones who are flying through space and arrive individually, really, really matters. And it determines the outcomes of whether, at that point, I don't know what's happened to the rest of humanity. So I don't really know. Maybe I'm pushing the analogy too far, but if at that point I'm the only remaining human being, because humanity has actually not made the decisions that you and I would both hope them to have made to survive, then you would have to kind of accept that had gone badly wrong. But I think equally, if you're defending the human species that has an enormous creativity, it has an enormous sense of vision of what the good life is, it has a vision of what progress means, it has a vision of what being morally good is, and that sense of moral goodness and that vision and that sense of purpose and that aspiration and the creativity to create a better world and to envisage and act for change, that potential is the best of what it is to be human.
No, absolutely. And this potential comes with a responsibility, but it also comes with vast opportunity and possibility that we can create based on the physicality and sociality that we have. Tim, thank you so much for being a guest on the Just Another Mindset podcast. And if you have any final words or comments for today,
No, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for your work, and I'm really looking forward to where your work goes in the Wellbeing Economy Initiative in particular. And I think for me, the Wellbeing Economy Initiative is one of those places where these ideas come together and also have some political impact. It's there's some really interesting political initiatives which we didn't have time to talk about, but I know that the Wellbeing Economy Alliance is very much engaged in those, and I think what we need as much as anything is places where we can have these kinds of conversations, even when they're difficult, even when they don't offer immediate everyday solutions. The ability to think about the kind of life, the kind of society we want, that lies at the heart of the very concept of well-being.
Creating room for conversations like that, I fully do agree, and it's also always good to have a reason to come back for round 2 and 3, Tim. So thank you very much. Have a wonderful
Look forward
day.
to that. Thanks. Bye.
If you enjoy this podcast and learn from it, please feel free to share this episode with a friend or two, and make sure to subscribe to the Just Another Mindset podcast on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, please use the next 10 seconds to give the Just Another Mindset podcast a rating, and know that you will help me to create more meaningful content like this, and also that it will help other people to find this content and get inspired as well. If there is any future topic or guest that you would like to hear more about on the Just Another Mindset podcast, please let me know by leaving a comment on YouTube or sending a mail directly to contact@ismaelwondergarten.com. And if nobody told you lately, be reminded that you are worthy, you matter, and you can achieve anything.
Be yourself, positive. Just another mindset.